Hi. So, a while back, I don't know exactly how long because I work from home and have little to no concept of the passing of time, I made a video going over the quote unquote doll collecting dark ages, which, if you didn't know, was a period from around 2015 to 2019 where doll collecting as a hobby took a bit of a downward turn. And this was due to a lot of reasons I won't go too deeply into because I covered them in that video. But what's important to know is that the period immediately following the Dark Ages has become known as the doll collecting Renaissance. And the doll collecting Renaissance is a period of abundance. It's where we saw a bunch of new collectors enter the hobby, a bunch of new creators, myself included. I started making videos in the middle of this time period, and most importantly, a bunch of new dolls. And that's basically what today's video is about, because I do feel like for the most part, what we thought of as the Renaissance, I need to stop with these air quotes, sorry, but what we know or knew as the Renaissance is basically kind of over with. And that's been a pretty big topic of discussion lately, along with the question of whether or not we're entering another dark age, which I do also want to talk about, but more than that, I just want to go back and reminisce, I suppose, because it's the end of the year. It's the perfect time for looking back, right? So this here will be just a little retrospective on the doll collecting Renaissance, what started it, why it happened, why it ended, and a little where are they now, I guess, on some of the dolls that came and went during it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. I do want to say, though, that these terms that I'm using, Dark Age and Renaissance, are more or less kind of colloquial, not in any way official or acknowledged by any toy company, so there's some disagreement about the exact time period here and there, but almost unanimously, we all agree that the Renaissance officially starts in 2019 with the release of Snapstar. I'm just kidding. It was LOL-OMG, the release of LOL-OMG in 2019. But first, some context. Before these dropped, the doll aisle was primarily dominated by blind box toys, and this is a trend that still somewhat persists to this day. But in 2017 and 2018, they were everywhere. Some were pretty okay, like Hairdorables, which came out around 2018. I really liked those, but most were really cheap, really gimmicky, and definitely a lower standard than, the traditional fashion doll. But no blind box doll was more ubiquitous than MGA's LOL Surprise. These first came out in 2016 to a rather negative reaction from the doll collecting community. I remember seeing these and thinking, yeah, I'm pretty desperate to buy some new dolls, but not that desperate. As you should know, though, adult doll collectors were not the primary audience. Children were, and children loved these. A New York Times article published in 2020, so about 4 years after their debut, prices the LOL Surprise brand at an estimation of 5 billion doll hairs. This coming right after the big failure of the 2015 Bratz reboot was a monumental blessing for MGA, and a monumental plague upon the toy aisle because everything wanted to emulate LOL Surprise's success, hence the rapid explosion in blind box toys. But somewhere along the line, I guess MGA wanted to return to form, to put out something they were more well known for, and thus, in 2019, enters the outrageous Millennial Girls. Yes, that is actually what OMG stands for. LOL-OMG is a direct spin-off of LOL Surprise, with the dolls being the older sisters of established LOL Surprise characters, and also obviously being in the same art style, which was very off-putting for some people, myself included. I did not like these when I first saw them, and I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't there like 30 LOL-OMG dolls right behind you? Yes, there are. They grew on me. They grew on me pretty fast. It was the second release that they came out with, the Winter Disco one, where I started thinking, well, maybe they're not so bad. I picked up Dolly from that line. She was my very first LOL OMG doll, and I guess I just sort of fell in love because it had been so long since I went out and bought a doll that was so well designed, well constructed, well made. And then Series 2 came out with Candylicious, and it was all over for me. I was all in. But no, seriously, LOL OMG was the first doll that we were seeing in a few years that had not only a lot of effort put into it, but a lot of investment. These dolls, regardless of what you think of them aesthetically, were extremely high quality and also very fashionable, which was also something we were missing. Fashion. And I think a lot of collectors felt the same way because around the time I started collecting them, I noticed a lot of people starting to as well. So this really is where the doll collecting renaissance begins. Because LOL OMG was also a pretty instant success, and toy companies started to take notice. Hey, fashion dolls are selling. Maybe we should start putting out dolls. Maybe we should start investing more into our dolls. Crazy idea, right? But this is where it all begins. And LOL OMG would go on to be a huge driving force in the doll market. The remix line from 2020 was extremely well received and extremely sought after by collectors. And children, of course. But I think that's another facet to be aware of in the fashion doll market. We start to see a lot of marketing towards collectors, or companies being open to the idea that their products can be enjoyed by both children and adult collectors, even if we're not the primary audience. Which was not a totally new concept, but I don't think we'd previously seen this level of feeling catered towards, I guess you could say. LOL OMG did put out a line specifically aimed at adult collectors, the LOL OMG Fierce line in 2022, which unfortunately did flop pretty hard, and that was sort of the beginning of the end. But even all the way towards the end of LOL OMG, they were putting out some great dolls. Series 8 in 2023, Ace and Perla from this year, they were still holding their heads up high. However, earlier this year, LOL OMG was accused of plagiarism and sued. And after 2 failed attempts, the third one ended up being the nail in the coffin, and MGA lost that court battle, and also $71.5 million. I don't want to go too deep on the details of the case because everything is pretty public, and I'll be blunt and say that talking about that invites the most annoying people on the planet to my channel for some reason. But I do not think we'll be seeing any more LOL OMG dolls in the future. All that said, LOL OMG was absolutely the driving force behind a lot of this doll collecting renaissance, even if they weren't able to see it all the way through. But LOL OMG was not the only big player, obviously, but also not even MGA's only big player. It wasn't long after LOL OMG debuted that MGA announced that Bratz would be returning. And whereas LOL OMG was ostensibly for kids with a wider appeal for adults, Bratz took a turn towards marketing very specifically to adults, as in adults who grew up with Bratz and were now very nostalgic for the brand. Because Bratz, even though it was technically on hiatus, it never left the public consciousness. They did put out some collector dolls in 2018, and even though they're very highly sought after now, they were not well received in their time, mainly due to some very unfortunate quality control issues. But even more than that, there was the big Bratz challenge trend. Remember that? It was a trend where you would basically just do your makeup inspired by a Bratz doll. There were videos on YouTube of dressing or styling yourself like a Bratz doll. And MGA, I think, saw the gap in the market of adults who were not necessarily doll collectors or really even interested in buying dolls, but were nostalgic for dolls. Because at first, Bratz's return was not really a doll line. It was far more of a social media lifestyle sort of brand. Their feeds were full of topical pop culture references. They were collaborating with adult fashion brands, stores like Dolls Kill and Hot Topic. And the dolls that did come out were very much collector pieces, like collaborations with fashion brands like GCDS and Moalola. And this new direction for the brand was pretty divisive, I think. Now that we're in 2024 and we've gotten a lot more products like reproductions and new playline releases, it's become a lot more favorable. Honestly, the subject of how MGA marketed Bratz in the early 2020s could be a video in of itself. It's a journey, highs and lows.
Love this game.
But it's just the fact that we'd never really seen anything like this before. A doll brand that was once more for children, now catering exclusively to adults, acknowledging that its fan base had grown up and wanting to grow up alongside them. And I do think at some points MGA kind of lost the plot and went for a more mass appeal over appealing to Bratz fans and Bratz collectors. This approach did bring a lot of new people into the hobby, for better or for worse, because the prices of Bratz secondhand notoriously kind of skyrocketed. That was the first video I ever posted on this channel, actually, ranting about the high prices of Bratz and how it was mainly due to this sudden surge of inexperienced collectors. That said, I don't think it's ever a bad thing for there to be more people in a hobby. Well, maybe sometimes, but in this case, no. The more doll collectors, the better. And this conjunction of LOL OMG and Bratz coexisting in their separate ways introduced a lot of new people into the hobby. And Bratz are still going pretty strong, I would say. They just had a collaboration with Mean Girls that was really, really exciting. The actual launch was kind of an unmitigated disaster, but not because people didn't want the dolls. More like specifically because everyone wanted the dolls. They're still doing reproductions and releasing new playline stuff, so as far as doll lines go, they've got their bases covered. And I promise we'll talk about companies other than MGA, but really at any point in time, the big players in the doll world are going to be MGA and Mattel. Still, I can't move forward without also talking about Rainbow High. And for Rainbow High, I do have a video specifically talking about their evolution over the years, but in the context of this video, you need to know that Rainbow High launched in 2020 and was also a pretty immediate success. Oh, another important piece of context, we know what happened in 2020, right? The certain global event that forced a lot of people to pick up new hobbies to keep themselves sane and distracted. Yeah, we remember. It's pretty safe to say that a lot of people picked up doll collecting then too, toy collecting in general. It was framed in the media as people looking towards childhood nostalgia for comfort in a dark time, which I guess could be true for a lot of people, but I just really like little plastic women. Anyways, Rainbow High, it came, it saw, it conquered. Rainbow High Series 1 might not look like anything worth, celebrating now, but again, you have to remember that our options were highly limited when it came to dolls, and here comes Rainbow High with these highly detailed outfits. 2 highly detailed outfits. Heads full of silky nylon hair, great articulation, inset eyes, just really exceptionally well-made dolls. And especially this early on, I'll admit that Rainbow High fashion was a little hit or miss for me personally, but I will always acknowledge how quality these dolls were. I don't think we had seen playline dolls with this level of thought and execution since 2003, 2004 with Bratz and My Scene. So naturally, Rainbow High attracted a lot of adult collectors, and MGA takes notice and starts to acknowledge these collectors, puts out products specifically for them. And even on the playline level, honestly, it seemed like a lot of the dolls were made with collectors in mind. We also start to see releases treated like these big events, complete with exclusive influencer parties even. Rainbow Vision, Shadow High, they had huge online presences and generated a lot of attention. Doll YouTube starts to really kick off too. And there's always been doll YouTubers, obviously. There are YouTubers who were active when I was younger, who are still active now. But starting around 2015 and 2016, there was a very noticeable dip in activity. Just less interest in general in new products and watching unboxings and reviews. But in a post-Rainbow High world, it's all here again. Companies are sending out PR. We have more quote-unquote doll influencers than ever before, not with an audience of children, but with their fellow adults. This ended up being a sort of a double-edged sword for Rainbow High, because whereas the Playline products were usually a pretty big hit, the collector products were flops. Big ones, with a few exceptions. Lily Chang, the Lunar New Year doll from 2022, was a huge hit, but after her, they really struggled to find exactly what adult collectors were looking for. And that has led to Rainbow High recently undergoing a big rebranding, where they have intentionally aged down the target audience. And this is reflected in the products, both in quality and in execution, which admittedly is not a wholly terrible thing, but I think it is very reflective of how this golden age, this renaissance of adult doll collecting is starting to kind of close out. But we'll get there. I'm getting ahead of myself. Another big facet of the doll collecting renaissance is not just that there are good dolls on shelves, it's also the fact that there are options. There is competition. 2020 also saw another big comeback, Monster High, which had been radio silent since around 2018 or so, which probably doesn't sound like a long time, but Monster High had left us on such a sour note. First off, Monster High G2, the reboot, was a huge proponent in the Dark Ages even happening, because the fallout caused a lot of collectors to leave the hobby. And after years of negative to middling reception, it just kind of fizzed out, very unceremoniously. But now Monster High is back, and vowing to do it right this time. Because now it had two separate branches. G1, the first generation, would continue, much like Bratz had for collectors who had grown up with Monster High and were adults now. So collector releases and reproductions of the original dolls, and also the Skelector line, which featured Monster High dolls of real iconic horror movie characters. Very much a big hit. And Generation 3 would be primarily aimed at children, with Playline dolls, an animated series, and even the first live-action movie. And this relaunch, also like Bratz, was not without controversy. A lot of people were mad that G3 was so different from what they had remembered. My personal opinion is that it is never that serious, and I think G3 is a lot of fun. Speaking as a Monster High fan who's been here since 2010, a lifelong collector, essentially, I understand it's not for everyone, and that's fine, but I also think having two avenues of collecting, one for the original generation and one for the new, was pretty smart. G1 was also noted for having kind of disastrous releases, though. But again, it's because they're so in demand. Collectors from the G1 era are coming back into the hobby. New collectors brought in by G3 are coming into the hobby. Whether opinions are positive or negative, Monster High is fully integrated back into the cultural zeitgeist. So you have Bratz and Monster High running simultaneously. We have a rivalry. And yeah, I think brand loyalty to a doll company is kind of stupid, but competition is healthy for the doll market, and it's something that had been sorely missed too. Because for a while, it was always just one company dominating the toy aisle, but now they have to fight for space and attention, and for us, for collectors, that's a great thing. And of course, there was Barbie. There's always Barbie. But once again, Barbie from 2015 to 2019 was disappointing. She'd been in a rough spot for quite a while, actually, since the early 2010s, but she'd been taking steps to hopefully regain some public favor, including expanding the line's diversity and inclusion, and creating a more wholesome, more down-to-earth, more relatable image for herself. Which brought in a lot of good things. Diversity and inclusion are unequivocally good things. But the fashion of Barbie in this era was, I guess in a word, just bad, lazy, thoughtless, etc., etc. We know this. 2020, though, is when we start to see Barbie shift towards a more creative place again. Barbie Extra, which debuted in 2020, was very much made to compete with LOL OMG and featured fashions that were a lot more eccentric and colorful and over-designed than we had seen in a long while. Sometimes utterly hideous, but the effort was there, the spirit was there. I think what was most significant for Barbie, though, was the Barbie movie. Hype for that had been present since around 2021, but 2022 is when it goes all out. The marketing for this movie was not only insane, but insanely successful. And ultimately, it was almost completely aimed at adults. The movie, though not inappropriate, was very much for adults. All the products and the 10,000 brand collaborations that spawned out of nowhere were aimed at adults. The dolls, mostly Playline, I think we were also primarily aimed at adults. And we got plenty of collector dolls too, mostly Ken, but you know. And some of the movie's marketing was organic. Like the whole Barbie core trend, that wasn't initiated by Mattel. They would eventually sort of take over it for their own purposes, but that was formed entirely by people who were just excited for the Barbie movie and excited to see Barbie be this huge public figure again. So as you can imagine, we get a lot of new collectors from that too. So we have LOL OMG, Bratz, Rainbow High, Monster High, Barbie, all these big doll cultural phenomenons all at once. The doll aisles were stocked. The doll harvests were plentiful. The doll goddesses were pleased with our offerings and were bestowing upon us their blessings. Obviously, though, they weren't the only dolls on the market, so let's go through some of the other players, too. I mentioned Hairdorables earlier. Well, they would eventually go on to give us Hairdorables Hairmazing, which were full-scale fashion dolls of the Hairdorables characters, much in the same vein as LOL OMG. These were really cute. Not quite on the same level of quality as LOL OMG, but I was already a big fan of Hairdorables and just found these to be really charming and creative. Unfortunately, the parent company took a pretty big hit from said global event mentioned earlier, and they were canceled pretty quickly into its run. In 2020, Mattel launched Cave Club, which was a line of prehistoric themed dolls. I have to admit, I did not pay a lot of attention to these when they first came out. I think the aesthetic is just one I don't really vibe with, which is a personal hang-up. I do think, looking back now, they're pretty cute, creative too, but they just weren't very popular, and I think Mattel gave up on them around the time they were planning to fully relaunch Monster High, but they serve their purpose. Not on a surprise, first came out in 2019. These were by MGA. They were kind of fashion doll, rag doll hybrids, except also not really. The bodies were plastic, just covered with the fabric shell. I don't know, I always found them kind of strange and unwieldy, but they were decently popular with collectors, I think. Glow Up Girls from Far Out Toys, these were another that really tried to integrate social media into their presence. And Felfix from Moose Toys, which had a very similar get ready with me sort of gimmick, just with more controversy that unfortunately led to them being canceled. But that was a big thing too, a focus on these unboxing experiences. Because again, unboxing videos were all the rage. Enchantimals, of course, because no matter what, Enchantimals will be present. They will be there, and they will be watching. You can count on that. We got two different mermaid lines, Mermaid High from Spin Master, which came out in 2021, and Mermaids Mermaids from MGA, which came out in 2022. Neither stuck around for very long, but both got a pretty decent amount of attention. Mermaids especially, because I think they were so divisive among collectors for just how striking they look. Striking, that's probably a good word. I think they're very beautiful. Many disagree with me, and that's fine. I mean, I think Diva Stars are adorable, so I'm used to being booed for my tastes. And those are just the ones I can think of right now. There were a lot more. Like, companies during this time really weren't afraid of experimenting and taking risks, and we got some cool, if incredibly short-lived dolls out of it. Like, oh my god, Style Bay from 2023, just an absolutely bizarre release. Very strange dolls, but I love and I appreciate the boldness of them, you know? You could go into the doll aisle and you could find something, regardless of your age, regardless of your personal aesthetic, regardless of your taste level. If you were into fashion dolls, you could probably find at least one thing that appealed very strongly to you, which also made doll collecting more accessible than ever too, because you can just go to the store and buy a doll, which, I mean, you could always do at any point in time, but now there are so many online communities, so many more ways to connect with fellow collectors, with fandoms to find information. And all of that is still very true. They're still making dolls. There's still very active collecting communities. But do I think we're still in a doll collecting renaissance? I mean, no, not really. I think the people who found the hobby recently are now very firmly in it, and the people who weren't super invested are on their way out. But I don't envision a huge surge of new collectors and new attention like what we just experienced anytime soon. Because looking back at it, it was just a perfect storm of announcements, of reboots, of marketing. All of it came and worked together so wonderfully in intentional and also completely unintentional ways. But all of it is kind of over, like it's done with. The hype for the new Barbie movie, I don't think that could be recreated anytime soon. The influence of LOL OMG on the doll market, I don't think that could be replicated anytime soon. And that's fine, because I don't think we're entering a new dark age. Like, I really don't. I think many things to do with the market are shifting and adjusting, and us adult collectors have to deal with not being the center of attention when it comes to toy companies once again. But it doesn't mean the doll industry is in a terrible state. It might not be in an especially wonderful state currently, but it's not dying. It's not going anywhere. And there will always be collectors. There will always be people who love dolls and who are buying them and posting about them. And there will always be online communities for such things. I've loved dolls since I was a kid. I'm going to love dolls for the rest of my life. I know that for certain. And I'm always going to be a part of this community, regardless of how big or how small it might be. And that was a look back at the so-called doll collecting renaissance. But now it's your turn. Let me know if you started collecting during this period, what drew you to it. If you collected before this period, what you thought of the sudden surge of new collectors. Tell me your favorite things to collect during the Renaissance, and let me know what you hope to see from the doll industry moving forward. Really, whatever's on your mind, let me know down there in the comments. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe for any future fashion doll content. And remember, keep it cute.